Adolf Hitler was not born a messiah, was not marked by any obvious signs of destiny or exceptional capability that might have predestined him for the role he would eventually play in reshaping European history through systematic genocide and total war. He was instead a fractured, mediocre, deeply insecure man, whose entire personality was constructed around compensatory fantasies of greatness, and whose rise to power depended less on any inherent qualities he possessed, and far more on his uncanny ability to embody the collective fantasies and resentments and desperate longings of millions of people who projected onto him the qualities they themselves lacked, but desperately craved, who invested him with messianic significance, not because he had demonstrated any actual wisdom or capability, but because they needed him to be what they imagined him to be in order to give meaning to their own suffering and shame and humiliation. The psychological tragedy and horror of his life and career lies precisely in this gap between the actual man and the mythological figure that millions came to believe he was, in the way that collective delusion transformed an individual of utterly ordinary mediocrity into a figure that commanded the absolute loyalty and worship of an entire nation, in the mechanisms through which psychological vulnerability and desperate need can create conditions where even the most obvious contradictions and lies can be absorbed into a comprehensive mythology that becomes more real and more powerful than objective reality itself. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we conduct a psychological autopsy of Adolf Hitler, examining not the historical facts of his rise to power and his commission of genocide, but rather the specific mechanisms of personality development and psychological defense and narcissistic delusion that created the particular consciousness through which he experienced himself and the world, exploring how a man of profound mediocrity and fundamental emptiness came to command the allegiance of millions and to launch a continental war that killed tens of millions, analyzing the specific psychological structures that allowed him to commit genocide while experiencing himself as a prophet and visionary rather than as a criminal, and recognizing in his psychology patterns and mechanisms that remain present in human consciousness and that can potentially be activated again if the social and historical conditions that enabled his rise reappear in different forms and contexts. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889 in Linz, Austria, into a family structure that psychological research has identified as creating particular vulnerabilities toward narcissistic personality development. An absent authoritarian father who worked as a customs official and who provided little emotional warmth or unconditional acceptance. A mother who was emotionally available and indulgent, but who could not provide the stable internal sense of worth that comes from consistent, loving authority. An environment where the child learns that his value depends on external performance and achievement, rather than on being inherently loved and accepted for who he is. The young Adolf was a dreamy, artistic child who seemed content to lose himself in fantasy and imagination rather than engaging with the practical demands of education and social adaptation, who demonstrated early signs of the emotional distancing and difficulty with genuine human connection that would characterize him throughout his life, who retreated into elaborate internal fantasies when confronted with the frustrations and rejections that normal development inevitably produces. His application to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and 1908 was rejected on the grounds that his artistic ability was insufficient and that his aptitude lay in architecture rather than in painting. A rejection that triggered in him a psychological crisis that he never fully recovered from, that reinforced his sense that the world failed to recognize his genius and his worth, that society and institutions and authorities were incapable of understanding his true value. Rather than accepting this feedback as information about his actual capabilities and adjusting his aspirations accordingly, Hitler responded by retreating further into fantasy and by constructing an elaborate internal mythology in which he became increasingly convinced that his rejection by institutions and authorities was evidence not of his limitations, but of their blindness and corruption and unworthiness to judge him. The psychological mechanism operating here is what researchers have identified as defensive narcissism, a personality structure in which the individual responds to evidence of their actual limitations and failures, not by integrating that information into a more realistic self-concept, but by constructing an elaborate fantasy self that is superior to and separate from the actual self that experiences rejection and failure, creating a psychological split where the individual maintains simultaneous conviction in their own greatness and secret terror that they might actually be worthless and mediocre. Hitler spent the years between his academy rejection and his entry into the military in relative obscurity in Vienna, living in cheap boarding houses, surviving through a combination of family money and eventually a small state stipend for war widows, developing during this period an increasingly elaborate fantasy about his own special destiny and an increasingly bitter resentment toward those whom he blamed for his lack of recognition and advancement. The specific targets of this resentment were revealing and would establish patterns that would persist throughout his life. He blamed the cultural establishment and the intellectuals and the Jews, categories that in his mind became fused into a single enemy responsible for corrupting culture and preventing him from achieving the recognition his genius deserved. His anti-Semitism appears to have developed during this Vienna period through exposure to the prevalent anti-Semitic ideology and literature of the time, combined with his own psychological need for an enemy onto whom he could project his rage and humiliation and sense of injustice, creating in his mind a comprehensive conspiracy explanation for why the world had failed to recognize his worth, transforming his personal failures into evidence of vast forces arrayed against him and his kind, rather than as reflections of his own actual limitations. When World War I began in 1914, Adolf Hitler experienced it as a kind of salvation, an escape from the meaningless existence and obscurity that had characterized his early adulthood, and an opportunity to finally discover the purpose and significance that his fantasies had promised him. He volunteered for military service, served as a lance corporal and messenger in the military, experienced the war not as a catastrophic human tragedy, but as a great historical drama within which he could finally play a significant role and prove his worth through acts of bravery and loyalty. The war provided him with structure and purpose, and a clear hierarchy within which his role was defined, and he performed adequately within that structure, though never distinguishing himself through exceptional bravery or military capability, remaining throughout his military service a marginal figure without close relationships with his fellow soldiers or superior officers. Germany's defeat in 1918 was experienced by Hitler not as a tragic outcome of military miscalculation and exhaustion, but as a personal betrayal and a cosmic injustice. as the betrayal of the sacrifices he and others had made, and more importantly, as validation of the conspiratorial explanations he had already developed to account for his own failures. The world, or Germany specifically, had been betrayed by internal enemies and corrupting forces that prevented the nation from achieving the greatness that should have been its destiny. The psychological response to this defeat was to transform his personal sense of victimhood and humiliation into a national narrative of betrayal and recovery, to begin constructing an elaborate mythology in which he would position himself not as a marginal failed artist, but as the chosen instrument through which a humiliated nation would achieve its rightful place of dominance and power. The transformation from unemployed military veteran to political agitator began in 1919 when Hitler was assigned by the army to attend meetings of the German Workers' Party and to report on their activities, a task that revealed in him an unexpected talent for public speaking and for the manipulation of crowds through emotional rhetoric, and the repetition of simple slogans and the identification of clear enemies onto whom collective rage could be directed. He discovered that he possessed a particular ability to enter a kind of psychological trance state while speaking, in which his conscious self-awareness and self-consciousness dissolved, and he became entirely absorbed in performing the role of the prophet and visionary. A psychological state that was intensely gratifying, because it allowed him to experience himself as something other than and greater than the ordinary, mediocre, insecure person he actually was. By the early 1920s, Hitler had constructed a comprehensive alternative identity and had begun attracting followers who were also seeking meaning and purpose and explanation for national humiliation and personal failure. Individuals who projected onto him the qualities and capabilities they needed him to possess, who interpreted his ranting and his conspiracy theories and his grandiose prophecies not as the incoherent ravings of a disturbed individual, but as the pronouncements of someone who possessed special insight and understanding. The psychological mechanism operating here was mutual projection. Hitler needed followers who would validate his sense of special significance and chosenness. And millions of Germans needed a figure onto whom they could project their own longings for greatness and their fantasies about recovered national power and their desperate desire for someone to explain and remedy their sense of humiliation and failure. Adolf Hitler's charisma, the quality that observers found so compelling and that seemed to exercise an almost hypnotic power over those who encountered him, was not an inherent characteristic that he was born with, but rather a constructed psychological performance that he developed over years of practice, and that functioned as a kind of extreme emotional theatre, designed to produce altered states of consciousness in his audience that bypassed rational thought and triggered instead primitive emotional responses of tribal belonging and submission to authority. The mechanisms through which this charisma operated were not mysterious or supernatural, but rather the systematic exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities that his audiences shared, the use of repetition and emotional contagion, and the transformation of political messages into religious ritual, and the positioning of himself as the embodiment of national destiny and tribal identity. The voice and the gestures and the physical presence that Hitler developed became increasingly stylized and theatrical over time, representing the externalization of his internal fantasies about who he was and what role he should play, the performance of a version of himself that bore increasingly little relationship to the actual person beneath the performance. But that became so consistent and so emotionally powerful that observers came to experience the performance as the authentic self, rather than as a constructed identity, masking an ordinary and rather unremarkable individual underneath. His speeches employed techniques that psychological research would later identify as particularly effective at triggering emotional responses and bypassing critical thinking. The constant repetition of simple slogans and key phrases that would become embedded in memory through sheer frequency of repetition. The use of highly emotional language and apocalyptic imagery that triggered fear and anger and the impulse to action. The framing of complex political and economic problems in simplistic terms of good versus evil and Aryan superiority versus racial contamination. The rallies and public gatherings that the Nazi regime organized were designed as orchestrated emotional experiences where Hitler's performance would be amplified through the emotional resonance of the crowd, where the mass participation would create psychological states of excitement and transcendence that would become associated with Hitler and with loyalty to him and with the regime's ideology, where individuals would experience themselves as part of something vast and powerful and meaningful that transcended their individual insignificance and gave their lives a sense of purpose and connection to historical forces greater than themselves. The Nuremberg rallies in particular represented the perfection of this orchestrated manipulation of collective emotion, with their precise geometric formations of hundreds of thousands of people, their carefully choreographed lighting and sound and movement, their explicit design to produce altered states of consciousness through the dissolution of individual identity into collective identity, and the transformation of political devotion into religious worship. As Hitler's power consolidated, and as he gained the authority to implement his fantasies at scale, his psychology revealed increasingly the obsessive quality of his thinking and the way that his consciousness became entirely organized around a set of fixed ideas and apocalyptic visions that seemed to have originated in the psychological depths of his disordered personality, rather than in any analytical engagement with reality. His obsessions with racial purity and with the dangers posed by Jews and with the necessity of territorial expansion and living space and with the superiority of the Germanic peoples became the organizing principles through which he interpreted all experience and made all decisions, becoming more rigid and more all-consuming as contradictions between his fantasies and reality became increasingly impossible to ignore. The psychological mechanism of obsession operates through a particular pattern of reinforcement, where the mind becomes stuck in recursive loops of thought, where contradictory evidence and practical difficulties do not lead to reconsideration of the obsessive belief, but instead trigger greater intensity of investment in the belief as a way of defending against the anxiety that the contradiction creates. Hitler's response to evidence that contradicted his racial theories, or that demonstrated the failure of his strategies, was never to reconsider his beliefs, but rather to intensify his commitment to them, to search for explanations that would allow him to maintain his fundamental worldview intact, to project responsibility for failures onto his enemies or his subordinates rather than acknowledging any error in his own understanding or judgment. His decision-making became increasingly characterized by what psychologists call magical thinking, the conviction that through force of will and ideological purity, he could overcome practical limitations and constraints, and that if things were not working according to his expectations, the fault lay in the insufficient commitment or purity of those around him, rather than in any deficiency in his plans or understanding. The catastrophic strategic failures of the war, the failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority, the invasion of the Soviet Union that would ultimately prove his undoing, were not re-evaluated and corrected, but rather were responded to through increasingly desperate intensification of the original strategy and through purges and denunciations of those whom Hitler blamed for the failures. By 1944 and 1945, as Germany's military situation deteriorated beyond the possibility of any conceivable recovery, and as the reality of defeat became impossible to deny, Hitler's psychological state deteriorated into something approaching complete dissociation from reality, into a state where his grandiose fantasies about his own historical significance and destiny became more rigid and more delusional precisely as the external circumstances that might have supported those fantasies collapsed entirely. He spent increasing amounts of time in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, conducting meetings that had become entirely divorced from any strategic military reality, issuing orders about armies that no longer existed and about operations that had no possibility of success, speaking to advisors who had learned not to contradict him about the imminent deployment of secret weapons or the miraculous reversal of fortune that he seemed to expect. The psychological mechanisms through which Hitler maintained his sense of reality in the face of absolute defeat reveal with extraordinary clarity the power of ideological investment and narcissistic defense structures to maintain their internal integrity, even when objective reality has made them entirely untenable. He continued to speak about the historical mission of the Nazi regime, even as that regime was physically being destroyed, continued to express confidence in ultimate victory, even as Soviet and American forces were closing in on Berlin from different directions, continued to believe that his actions served some higher purpose, even as he ordered the destruction of German infrastructure and resources in a final act of nihilistic denial that would have destroyed the nation he had claimed to love if circumstances had allowed it to be fully implemented. The final days in the bunker reveal the complete psychological collapse of the fantasy structures that had maintained Hitler's grandiose self-concept and had allowed him to function despite the fundamental fragility of his psychological organization. Confronted with evidence of absolute defeat and the imminent end of everything he had constructed, Hitler experienced what appears to have been a complete psychological breakdown, alternating between rages of apocalyptic fury and moments of apparent detachment from reality, where he seemed to be living entirely in his internal fantasy world, losing the ability to distinguish between his wishes and desires and objective reality, experiencing himself as betrayed by history and by those around him, rather than as responsible for the catastrophe that he had caused. On April 30th, 1945, in the bunker surrounded by the ruins of the civilization he had attempted to construct, Hitler shot himself rather than face capture and trial and the judgment of history, an ending that represented in a final way the triumph of fantasy over reality, the choice to exit through suicide rather than to confront directly the truth that the great historical mission that had organized his entire adult life had been nothing more than the elaborate fantasy of a deeply disturbed individual whose charisma and rhetoric had allowed him to transform his personal pathology into a continental catastrophe. Adolf Hitler's psychology reveals with devastating clarity the mechanisms through which individual pathology can be transformed into historical catastrophe when that individual possesses the combination of narcissistic grandiosity and obsessive thinking and skill at emotional manipulation that allows him to embody the collective fantasies and resentments of millions of people who are themselves seeking meaning and explanation for their own suffering and humiliation. He was not an exception to human nature, but rather an extreme manifestation of psychological patterns and vulnerabilities that exist more mildly in many human beings. An individual whose particular combination of childhood deprivation and rejection and obsessive fixation and rhetorical skill created the conditions for him to become the focal point for collective projection and the vehicle for the expression of mass psychological needs. The psychological mechanisms through which Hitler maintained power and loyalty despite obvious contradictions and failures, and despite the devastation that his policies were producing, operated through his exploitation of human vulnerability to charisma and myth-making and the human hunger for meaning and belonging that transcends rational evaluation of evidence and logical assessment of consequences. People followed Hitler not primarily because they had carefully evaluated his arguments and found them convincing, but because they needed him to be what they imagined him to be. Because devotion to him provided psychological functions that their ordinary lives did not provide. Because the mythology surrounding him had become more real and more powerful to them than objective reality itself. The warning that Hitler's life and psychology provide extends to the recognition that the conditions that enabled his rise and the vulnerability that made millions susceptible to his manipulation remain present in any society. Where large segments of the population experience humiliation and economic desperation and loss of meaning and identity, where education systems emphasize obedience over critical thinking, where alternative sources of information and authority are suppressed or controlled, where circumstances allow the emergence of individuals with the particular combination of narcissistic pathology and rhetorical skill and willingness to exploit collective vulnerabilities for personal aggrandizement. The manufacture of messiahs and prophets and saviors is not a historical accident, but rather a recurring possibility whenever the psychological and social conditions that enable it are present. Whenever populations are desperate enough and ignorant enough and fragmented enough to project onto some individual the qualities and capacities that they desperately wish he would possess. The most terrifying aspect of Hitler's rise, and the most relevant lesson for contemporary societies, is that he was not exceptional in his individual pathology, or his particular combination of psychological traits, but rather represented an extreme but not unprecedented manifestation of patterns that exist more mildly throughout human populations, that the defenses against similar figures emerging in the future consist not in imagining that human nature has evolved, or that societies have become permanently immune to fascism through exposure to its historical consequences, but rather in maintaining the educational systems and institutions and safeguards against the concentration of power that make the exploitation of mass psychological vulnerabilities more difficult, in preserving space for critical thinking and alternative sources of authority and information, in remaining vigilant about the mechanisms through which demagogues and manipulators exploit human needs for meaning and belonging to justify domination and atrocity. This has been forgotten minds. Adolf Hitler died in a bunker surrounded by the ruins of the civilization he had attempted to construct. His final legacy, not the 1,000-year empire he had prophesied, but the psychological trauma and historical devastation that his fantasies had produced, demonstrating that the grandest visions and the most passionate certainties about historical destiny and the most compelling mythologies about racial superiority and national greatness can emerge from the fractured psychology of an individual whose primary achievement was not in creating anything of lasting value, but in transforming his own pathology into the instrument through which millions would be murdered and a continent would be devastated in the service of fantasies that had no foundation in reality, except the willingness of millions to believe in them. Until next time, stay vigilant.